She put herself in danger in the pursuit of a good story. She uncovered wrongs committed in society. She traveled around the world, and she did it all in a time when women weren't expected to do anything beyond get married, have children, and take care of the home. She lived her life very differently, and she faced backlash, but she never backed down, and she changed lives, and she changed journalism forever. Well, who was this courageous woman? That would of course be Nellie Bly, a woman ahead of her time. Though it's the name she's best known as today, Nellie Bly wasn't actually born as such. At her birth in 1864, she was christened Elizabeth Jane Cochran, and growing up she was indeed known by a different name altogether, and that would be Pink. She was a vibrant, energetic child who never shied from attention. Her mother encouraged her vivaciousness and allowed her to dress in bright colors. Most other girls and women in her hometown of Cochran, Pennsylvania, were wearing drab colors of brown, black, gray, and white. But Pink stood out. She had to. She had 13 brothers and sisters to contend with for attention, after all. The town was actually named after Bly's father, Judge Michael Cochran. Judge Cochran unfortunately passed away at an early age, and Bly was only 6 years old when it happened. Her father did not have a will, and his death left the family impoverished. Bly's mother remarried, but the marriage turned out to be a disaster. Her new husband, Bly's stepfather, was a violent drunk. When Bly's mother had finally had enough of this mistreatment, she filed for divorce. At only 14 years old, Bly was called upon to testify at the divorce trial. She had to speak up about what she had seen this violent man do and how he had mistreated her mother. True to her personality, even then, she was honest and witty, even in what must have been an incredibly difficult situation for a young teenager. During the trial, she told the court, "My stepfather has been generally drunk since he married my mother, and when drunk, he is very cross. He is cross sober too." The whole ordeal made an impression on Bly. In the era she was living in, marriage was supposed to be the ultimate goal for a woman, but having seen her mother's experiences, Bly knew that marriage didn't always mean a secure future or even happiness. Bly, she decided that she was going to make her mark on the world all by herself. Initially, Bly went to school for a career in teaching. For a woman, that was one of the only career paths available at the time. She was a good writer, but she wasn't a good student. Then, after only one semester, she couldn't afford the tuition, and her mother needed help at home, so she had to leave school. She moved with her mother and siblings to Pittsburgh, where they ran a boarding house for income. One day, Bly picked up a local newspaper and was aghast at a column she read. The title, it was enough to set her off, because it was "What Girls Are Good For." The actual contents, well, those were outright angering. The column asserted that women were good for nothing but staying at home and giving birth, and when it came to working women, well, the writer called them a monstrosity. Bly, she wasn't one to sit idly by and let something she disagreed with as much as this pass by. She drafted up a response using the pseudonym Lonely Orphan Girl. Her response caught the attention of the paper's editor, George Madden, but as she had written it under a pseudonym, he had no way to identify and get in touch with Bly. He was so impressed, though, that he didn't give up. He put an advertisement in the Pittsburgh Dispatch asking Lonely Orphan Girl to contact the paper and reveal her identity. And, well, why did he do this? Well, he wanted to give her a job. Bly responded to the advertisement and was given the chance to write a column on a trial basis. After her column was published in the Pittsburgh Dispatch, Madden hired her for a full-time job. While at the Dispatch, Cochran officially adopted the name that the world would come to remember. Of course, that would be Nellie Bly. She worked for only $5 a week, but she had a platform to share her ideas about women's independence. Bly also began the work that would make her famous, outing social wrongs as an undercover reporter. She combined the two messages by going undercover as a factory worker and writing an expose on the poor conditions that women faced as they tried to earn pennies to help feed their families. She also wrote about the unfair treatment of women who were in divorce proceedings, a topic she knew a thing or two about because of her mother's experience. But her articles were controversial, and advertisers don't like controversy. Sound familiar? They started to pull their ads from the Dispatch, and the publisher got nervous. If she was going to cause problems for their bottom line, they didn't see the value in keeping Bly in this role that was so atypical for a woman at the time. So they put her where women writers usually worked, the fashion and society pages. Bly wasn't really happy with this move. In 1887, at only 23 years old, she moved by herself to New York City. She didn't have a job when she went to the big city. In fact, she was unemployed for months. She wasn't willing to give up though, and kept visiting offices and applying for work. After 4 months, she hit the jackpot. The New York World offered to let her try out an assignment. Run by Joseph Pulitzer, the paper was a prominent publication, and Bly, she was up to the job. One of her first assignments at the New York World became her most famous. It also made a difference with the treatment of some of society's most vulnerable people. In the late 19th century, the mentally ill were locked up and isolated from society. One place they were sent in New York was the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island. And Bly and her editors, well, they wanted to get into that institution. She was eager to do so, even though she didn't know how she was going to get out. All she was told in preparation for this assignment was, write up things as you find them, good or bad. Give praise and blame as you think best, and the truth all the time. She spent days preparing, practicing facial expressions to make herself seem as out of it as possible. Then she went to a boarding house to spend the night. While there, she pretended to be afraid of everything at the house. She spent hours just staring at the wall and saying nothing. In short, she simply did her best to act insane. It worked, and the head of the boarding house called the cops, and Bly was taken away. The police had her analyzed by doctors at the Bellevue Hospital. Bly claimed to have amnesia, and her case caught the attention of the media, though no one recognized her as a journalist. Ultimately, the doctors were able to recommend that this young, pretty, and apparently insane woman be committed to Blackwell Island. Now, even before she arrived at the asylum, she had her first bit of information for her exposé. Asylums apparently weren't all that hard to get into. When she arrived there, this observation was cemented for her, as she met other patients who didn't seem to have all that much reason to be locked up and away from society. Once she was in the asylum, Bly didn't act at all. She decided to just be herself, and interestingly, this didn't arouse suspicion at all. In fact, it actually did the opposite. Bly later observed, "The more sanely I talked and acted, the crazier I was thought to be." Daily life, it was tough at the asylum. Bly was forced into cold baths and was freezing most of the time that she was committed. My teeth chattered and my limbs were goose-fleshed with blue and cold. Suddenly I got, one after the other, 3 buckets of water over my head, ice-cold water too, into my ears, my eyes, my nose, and my mouth. The food was horrific. Dirty water served alongside rotting meat, gruel, and nearly inedible bread. Patients ate in areas surrounded by waste and with rats crawling around their feet. Their days were spent sitting on hard benches, and some patients were even tied together. In her initial newspaper report, and later in a published book, Bly described the horrific treatment of asylum patients and how it might be making the patients even worse. She wrote, "What, accepting torture, would produce insanity quicker than this treatment? Here is a class of women sent to be cured. I would like the expert physicians who are condemning me for my action, which has proven their ability to take a perfectly sane and healthy woman, shut her up, and make her sit from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. on straight back benches. Do not allow her to talk or move during these hours. Give her no reading, and let her know nothing of the world or its doings. Give her bad food and harsh treatment, and see how long it will take to make her insane. 2 months would make her a mental and physical wreck." Bly lasted 10 days at Blackwell Island. She was released when the paper contacted the asylum and asked for her release. 2 weeks later, the piece was published in the New York World, and it grabbed the attention of the country. People were outraged and were calling for change. A grand jury was convened, and Bly joined them in devising a series of changes that needed to be made at the asylum. The New York Department of Charities and Corrections had $1 million added to its budget to help with improvements to the facilities that it oversaw, and overall safer and more humane conditions and treatments were implemented at the asylums. Bly became a celebrity. She was praised for her bravery and her willingness to speak out about societal ills. But her work was far from over. Even with her fame, she kept up her undercover reporting. The same year she went undercover at the asylum, Bly also went undercover for a piece of a lighter nature. She wanted to find out about the active industry in New York City that sought to find women husbands. She wrote, "This husband getting interested me. I did not want to marry, but I was as interested as a little boy with a dynamite cartridge." On another occasion, she wrote about a sadder New York industry, baby buying. And she indeed took on the New York government, exposing the actions of a prominent lobbyist who was essentially bribing lawmakers. Nellie Bly had no shortage of topics to write on, and no shortage of courage to drive her forward in her investigations. But her appetite for adventure wasn't fully sated by writing articles about the seedy goings-on of New York City. In 1888, she was 24 years old, and she had an idea. She wanted to travel around the world, and she wanted to do it faster than Jules Verne's fictional character Phileas Fogg. And, of course, she wanted to write about it in the paper. Although she'd proven herself from her past assignments, Bly still faced reticence from her editors. Women working was quite difficult for the times. Women traveling by themselves was adding a new layer of defiance to the norms. They wanted to send a man around the world, and not Nellie. As she later wrote, the reaction to her request was along the lines of, "It is impossible for you to do it," was the terrible verdict. "In the first place, you are a woman, and you would need a protector. And even if it were possible for you to travel alone, you would need to carry so much baggage that it would detain you in making rapid changes. Besides, you speak nothing but English, so there is no use talking about it. No one but a man can do this." And so, what was her response to this? "Very well, start the man, and I'll start the same day for some other newspaper and beat him." It took a year, but her editors were eventually convinced that she could make the journey. At that time, women traveled with suitcases full of clothes and were often attended by escorts. But Bly again showed that she was ahead of her time. When the time came for her to depart on her trip around the world in 1889, she boarded the ship Augusta Victoria by herself and with only 2 small bags. She wore a dress and an overcoat and kept a few $100s in a bag tied around her neck. The first part of her trip, though, it was tough. Bly got seasick and couldn't hold down food. The only thing that made her feel better was sleeping. At one point, she slept for so long that the ship's crew thought that she had died in her cabin. She landed in England and went on to France. In France, she met Jules Verne, the man who inspired the trip. From France, she traveled to Egypt, Ceylon, Hong Kong, and Japan. In China, she visited a leper colony. Along the way, she traveled aboard ships and rickshaws and trains, even riding horses when needed to. Back home in the United States, her readership was kept updated via telegraph. All the time Bly was traveling the world, people were keeping a close eye on the dispatches that she sent from abroad. They had more than a passing interest in her venture, for there was a prize at stake. The New York World had decided to make the most of Bly's trip to drive up their audience and build their brand. They offered a trip to Europe for the person who was closest to guessing Bly's return time to her starting point. People made guesses literally down to the second. Meanwhile, they were also following another trip around the world. Upon hearing of Bly's stunt, a rival New York newspaper decided they couldn't let the New York World get all the attention, so they sent a female reporter of their own around the globe. Elizabeth Bisland left New York, heading the opposite way, traversing the United States first, before heading across the Pacific. Bisland took 4 days longer than Bly to travel the world. The final leg of Bly's global trip was across the Pacific Ocean. She made her way across the world's largest ocean on the RMS Oceanic, but the ship hit rough weather on the crossing. Bly was 2 days later than she had planned for her arrival back to the US. She disembarked in San Francisco and boarded a private train to take her back to the East Coast. 72 days after departing aboard a ship in Hoboken, New Jersey, she was back. Not only had she beaten Phineas Fogg's fictional record, she had set a world record of her own. Indeed, Nellie Bly had once again proven her naysayers wrong. She said, "I always have a comfortable feeling that nothing is impossible if one applies a certain amount of energy in the right direction. When I want things done, which is always at the last moment, and I am met with such an answer, 'It's too late, I hardly think it can be done,' I simply say, 'Nonsense. If you want to do it, you can do it. The question is, do you want to do it?'" Bly published a book about her adventure, and the New York World was happy with the increased attention they received thanks to Bly. But apparently they were not happy to give Bly a bonus. Insulted at this, she resigned. She didn't have a job, but she wasn't suffering. Quite the opposite. She had become a national celebrity. Her image and name were worth money, so popular had she become with her adventure around the world. And by this point, she wasn't even 30. Within 3 years of her departure, the New York World, well, they wanted her back. She started writing for the paper again in 1893, once again taking on investigative assignments. These assignments had the goal of rooting out corruption and mistreatment. Although she had always said that she had no plans to marry and had indeed lived out her life in defiance of the expectations of women, Bly eventually met a man and decided to settle down. In 1895, she met and married a 73-year-old man. Bly was just 31. Her husband, Roger Seaman, was the head of the ironclad manufacturing industry. Marriage didn't mean that Bly was ready to become a housewife and not work. Quite the opposite, in fact. She started to get involved with the manufacturing company, offering designs for products and helping oversee its operations. 2 of the designs she created for the company were patented, a milk can and a garbage can. In 1896, she quit working for the New York World to focus more of her time at the ironclad manufacturing company. When her husband died in 1904, she even took over as its president. Her time in that role lasted less than a decade, as the company filed for bankruptcy in 1911. When the company failed, Bly jumped right back into what she knew best, and that was reporting. The women's suffrage movement was in full swing, and Bly wrote about the marches and calls for the vote. In the latter half of the 1910s, she covered World War I, giving her another groundbreaking title. She was the first female war correspondent in the United States. Fully back into journalism, she got her own column in the New York Journal in 1919, but sadly, her return to writing didn't last long. In 1922, when she was only 57 years old, Bly contracted pneumonia. The The illness would prove to be the only thing that could keep her down. On January the 27th, 1922, Bly lost her life to pneumonia at St. Mark's Hospital in New York City. Fittingly, the next day's edition of the Evening Journal called her the best reporter in America. Nellie Bly was a trailblazer, not just for women, but for all journalists. Her writing made a difference in people's lives, affecting change in government and inspiring and lighting people's imaginations. From an early age, she showed great courage. She knew what she wanted, and she went for it, letting nothing, especially not the fact that she was a woman, stand in her way. As she was a writer, perhaps her own words sum up her life best. I said I could, and I would, and I did. So I really hope you enjoyed that episode of Biographics. If you did, there's a couple of things you could do right now. One is hit that like button below. Also, if you want more stuff like this, we put out brand new videos every Monday and every Thursday, so hit that subscribe button below. And subscribe button doesn't do what it used to on YouTube. If you actually want to get a notification about these videos, please do hit that bell button next to the subscribe button, and that'll send you a notification every time, every Monday and Thursday when we put out a new video. Also, if you want to watch something else right now, stuff from the archive, over there on the right. And as always, thank you for watching.